Welcome to a new podcast episode from Luxamed GmbH. My name is Patrick Walitschek, and today we're talking about something that seems rather technical at first glance, but actually makes a huge difference in practice between a therapy that works and one that basically just runs without anything actually happening. Specifically, it's about the application with electrodes, meaning the electrode placement. Many of you know this. You're shown a picture, a template, a placement, maybe from a seminar, from a book, or from a colleague, and then you take exactly that picture and apply it to every patient who has similar symptoms. And yes, that sounds practical, but to be honest, it's sometimes the exact opposite of therapy. This episode is intentionally a bit more detailed than usual because electrode placement is one of the topics where, in over 20 years of practice and teaching, I most frequently see therapists get insecure as soon as the standard placement simply doesn't work anymore. So today, let's take the time to really sort this out from the ground up, from the historical development to the theory, all the way to very concrete decision-making aids for your daily practice, meaning for your application, practical application of microcurrent therapy. Internally, we have a saying for this that I also bring up again and again in our seminars, which is copy and paste quickly becomes copy and waste. What's behind that? If you simply copy an electrode placement from patient to patient without adapting it to the individual situation, you get what you could call a diverse redundancy. You repeat a pattern that might have fit the last patient, but simply doesn't fit the cause for the current one. The result is then a systematic error, not because the device doesn't work, but simply because the placement is in the wrong place. And that is exactly the point I want to go into a bit deeper today. An electrode placement is an idea, not a recipe. If the placement is correct, but success still fails to materialize, let's look a bit closer into that now. Imagine a chronic knee pain patient. The obvious reaction, electrodes on the knee, start therapy, locally focused exactly where it hurts. By the way, historically, that was also the first approach we ever worked with in microcurrent-therapy. You basically put the pain in a crosshair to achieve the greatest possible effect there. A very intuitive and understandable approach. We started establishing this approach specifically with the Clinic Master back in the year 2000. This can work wonderfully if the cause is actually in the knee. Post-operatively, for example, after a clear injury where you don't have to look long for the cause, then the local placement is exactly right. Direct influence on the tissue, targeted scan, fast reaction. But if the knee pain actually, let's look at the example, comes from the hip, from the foot, from the ankle, from a biomechanical chain that only shows up in the knee but doesn't originate there, then I can treat the knee therapeutically until, let's call it, I'm blue in the face. I simply won't achieve a lasting effect. And I always say that this is kind of a blessing and a curse of microcurrent therapy at the same time, because we are clearly working here in metabolism, in cell regulation, and there, of course, we have to get to the cause, meaning identify and find the cause. But first, it's worth taking a close look at what microcurrent therapy can actually achieve physiologically and what it can't. With a classic conduction anesthesia, the transmission of stimuli in a nerve is interrupted. Clear case. To put it simply, the pain is blocked on its way to the brain, regardless of where the actual cause lies. That is not comparable to microcurrent, even if the effect of rapid pain relief is perceived similarly. We do not interrupt stimulus transmission. We influence metabolic processes locally, directly in the treated tissue. So things like ATP production, membrane transport, cell communication. That is a fundamental difference. Conduction anesthesia works wherever the nerve runs, regardless of the location of the cause. Microcurrent works where the electrodes are placed, and only there. If the actual problem lies elsewhere, the therapeutic success logically simply fails to materialize, no matter how precisely the placement is positioned on the knee itself. The fact that muscle and joint pain can actually originate in a completely different place than where it is felt is also well described outside of microcurrent therapy. In a frequently cited review article in the Deutsches Ärzteblatt, pain researcher Siegfried Menze showed that a persistent irritation of pain receptors in a muscle can lead to hyperexcitability of nerve cells in the spinal cord and a so-called central sensitization. This can lead to pain being projected to completely different regions of the body than where the actual source of irritation lies. And Menze published in 2008 that muscular tension is more often the consequence of a painful lesion in another muscle or joint than its actual cause. This aligns very closely with the clinical observation I just spoke about. The knee can hurt without the cause being there at all. Also, from movement and fascia research, there are anatomical explanatory models for this. Thomas Myers, with his standard work Anatomy Trains, which many of you surely know, a really very, very highly recommended book, will also be linked here in the show notes and, of course, on our website, described continuous myofascial chains that simply extend across multiple joints and muscle groups. And Richter and Hepken, in their work on trigger points and muscle function chains in osteopathy, systematically documented how such chains can simply be used diagnostically and therapeutically in manual therapy, published by Richter and Hepken in 2007. And this is not a purely theoretical description. Recent biomechanical studies using ultrasound motion analysis were able to directly show that movement in the ankle joint propagates measurably up into the thigh muscles via exactly these myofascial connections Myers talks about. In other words, the idea of a chain from the foot through the knee to the hip is not just practical experience, but can now also be proven biomechanically. What is also interesting at this point, even if you work purely locally on the knee, the cellular mechanism of action of microcurrent can now be described relatively concretely, which in turn explains why a local placement also makes sense cell biologically for an actually local joint problem. A study published in 2024 in Biomedical Engineering Letters showed that microstimulation on cartilage cells inhibits the pro-inflammatory signaling cascade via the so-called NFKB signaling pathway, thereby reducing both the production of cartilage-degrading enzymes and, in an animal model of osteoarthritis, reduces the degradation of subchondral bone structures. This was published by Lee et al. In 2024. This is a concrete cellular mechanism for why a local microcurrent application on the joint itself can achieve something, precisely because it acts directly on the inflammatory processes in the treated joint. Only this mechanism naturally doesn't solve a problem whose cause doesn't lie in the tissue under the electrodes at all, but in the chain before or after it. A second example from practice that makes this principle even clearer: a shoulder problem. Here, too, the intuitive reaction is to work locally in the shoulder, but shoulder problems in particular very often have a structural background, meaning a poor posture, a muscular imbalance that pulls the entire shoulder girdle into an unfavorable, let's call it, position. If you work systemically instead in such a case, meaning you regulate the entire system, the shoulder girdle naturally moves into a better position and the shoulder joint simply functions better again and can regenerate. Of course, this is not a contradiction to the local placement. It is simply a different strategy that, depending on the cause, can be the better choice. That is the core. A fixed placement without context is often risky, not because it would be wrong, but because it is a probability, yes, let's call it a 50-50 chance, you could say, and not a guarantee. Today, you can use a certain placement on a patient with excellent results. It works great. Tomorrow, on the next patient with similar symptoms, not at all. And the difficult part about it, the worst result that can happen with the device is not damage, but simply that simply nothing happens. No reaction, no progress. And then you have to ask yourself, Did I perhaps choose the wrong program? Or for those working in the FSM field, of course, did I perhaps choose the wrong FSM combinations, a wrong FSM recipe, so to speak? Or did I simply overlook something? Because microcurrent therapy works. We have proven this in many, many podcast episodes and studies that we can de facto evoke a cell metabolic reaction here. Now, the only question is, if I have a problem with the patient, work locally or however, but have no reaction, there are actually only three possibilities. Either I actually didn't evaluate the condition before and after correctly, so that I'm basically giving away results. I've seen that quite often too. Another variant is that the device isn't working at all, maybe has a defect, a cable is broken. That can happen, of course. The third variant is that I overlooked something. Therefore, we basically distinguish between two strategies of electrode placement. The local electrode placement, meaning direct influence on the affected tissue, ideal for trauma post-operative situations, so where the cause is clearly definable and you can focus closely. And the so-called global placement. Let's call it a holistic therapy, which, by the way, can also be combined very well with manual therapy or osteopathic techniques, stretching techniques, and so on, and above all, a causal therapy. And here, it's not about the location of the symptom, but about the chain behind it. Historically, it developed like this. The original approach over 20 years ago was the so-called Davos method, meaning where it hurts, right? Where the pain is. So exactly the local symptom-oriented placement we started with, and then over the years of exchange in courses and seminars, completely different schools, let's call them, emerged. Yes, we have users. One is an osteopath, another is a non-medical practitioner, another is a classic orthopedist, another works more according to whatever manual technique procedure. But they all work with the same device, but with completely different basic assumptions. And that is also a very, very important aspect. An osteopath in our network, for example, treats a knee problem consistently via other fascia areas and is successful with it. My longtime friend and also partner Matthias Rother, on the other hand, works almost exclusively with a system placement. This runs from the feet to the cervical spine, sacrum in the frontal area, and combines the whole thing with light therapy on the reflex muscle points, starting at the diaphragm, then via the lower extremities and up via certain muscle points. His reasoning behind it, the actual basic problem is usually completely elsewhere than where the symptom shows up. And with the system placement plus the combination of light therapy, we simply combine manual therapy techniques, relatively simple techniques, and with that, you often reach the goal much, much faster and above all, more sustainably than with a pure symptom treatment. A third school I'd like to mention at this point, because it simply completes the picture, is the regulation concept as represented for many years by, for example, non-medical practitioner Burkhard Hock, who has also been pushing and using microcurrent therapy in his practice for almost 20 years. Many of you might know him from Hock Pain Therapy or from the books, the excellent books, I must say, that he has published. And the basic idea behind it is almost philosophical, you could say. Every cell in the human body basically wants to work physiologically correctly. If a cell or a group of cells is not functioning properly, there must be a concrete cause for it, according to the principle of cause and effect. The symptom is then often simply the observed, the observable effect. Based on these thoughts, this concept is about searching for, identifying, and specifically treating the cause. And I'm not talking here about the choice of any programs or any frequency states or frequency protocols. It's concretely about the placement of the electrodes. And in doing so, three basic conditions for healthy cell regulation are distinguished. First, the supply and disposal of nutrients and waste products, respectively. Second, the provision of sufficient energy. And third, the coordination of processes, meaning the actual cell control. If these three conditions are met, according to this model, there is no longer a cause for a pathological condition in the tissue. A regulation disorder then corresponds exactly to a painful condition, you could say. Let me make the first point of these 3 points, the supply and disposal, a bit more concrete, because it simply shows well how practical this actually quite abstract model is meant to be. A central mechanism behind it is the osmotic pressure ratio at the cell membrane. Through diffusion, liquids and particles dissolved in them can pass through the semi-permeable, meaning semi-permeable cell membrane. This is a basic prerequisite for a cell to be able to regulate itself at all, so that nutrients can be transported in and waste products can simply be transported out. If these basic conditions at the cell boundary are not sufficiently met, exactly this can lead to a disruption of cell regulation, with the result that complaints or a solid symptomatology can occur. If these basic conditions at the cell boundary are not sufficiently met, exactly this can lead to a disruption of cell regulation, with the result that complaints or a solid symptomatology can occur. So this is not a vague thought, but a very concrete idea of what goes wrong on a cellular level when tissue is not functioning properly. And this is exactly where the regulation concept intervenes therapeutically, not primarily at the symptom, but at restoring this basic cellular condition. I'm not telling you this to present one of these schools as the only correct one. On the contrary, the exciting thing about it is that all 3 approaches, the local Davos method, the systemic placement, and the regulation concept, can work in practice with the same device on the same patient, but with completely different logic behind it. This shows very clearly there is no single correct electrode placement. There are different self-consistent models of thinking, which you should know and consciously choose, instead of simply blindly adopting a template using the copy and paste method. By the way, a study in the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies also shows that a conscious, broader, not purely local approach to myofascial complaints is clinically documented. It was published by Carolyn McMakin on the treatment of chronic myofascial lower back pain. In therapy-resistant patients who had previously not responded sufficiently to other procedures, a significant pain reduction that lasted over several treatment sessions was achieved with a specific, frequency-specific microcurrent application here. Yes, that was already published in 2004. This underscores once more that the choice of strategy, local, systemic, or combined, can actually make a measurable difference in treatment success, especially in patients where a, yes, first closely local attempt did not work sufficiently. Another controlled study from the Journal of Biological Regulators and Homeostatic Agents investigated pulsed low-intensity electrical neuromuscular stimulation in patients with myofascial pain syndrome of the cervical spine specifically. So exactly that symptom profile that is simply characterized by multiple trigger points and fascial tension across multiple chains. Within 2 weeks, the pain score on the visual analog scale in the treatment group dropped from 7 to an average of 3.8 points, while the control group benefited significantly less. This was published in 2016. The authors attributed the effect, among other things, to a normalization of the cell's bioelectricity, a thought that aligns strikingly closely with what we will discuss in a moment regarding the regulation concept. I think a good example of this is a systemic, not pinpoint precise logic, for example, with the classic lymph placement. There, it's not about hitting a 100% exact point, but about stimulating lymph peristalsis in the respective extremity. Historically, the placement developed in such a way that we used certain areas like the acupuncture point, large intestine 4, between the thumb and index finger, and on the upper and lower extremities, kidney 1 under the foot. It is a systemic approach, not a pinpoint precise one. The exact millimeter position of the electrode is actually secondary here compared to the question of whether lymph flow is stimulated in the correct region. Now let's come to another area, and that is actually also the conclusion of why a global placement actually works. So why does a global causal view work at all? Behind it is a concept that we refer to in our seminars as the tensegrity model. The term tensegrity is composed of tensional integrity. So something, you could say, tension integrity. The basic principle of this originally comes from architecture and sculpture, structures that are stable not through rigid connections, but through a balanced interplay of tension and compression ratios distributed throughout the entire system. That is the basic principle. If the tension changes in one place, the tension automatically changes in a completely different, seemingly unconnected place as well, because everything is connected to each other through the same structure. Applied to the human body, this means we don't function like a chain of individual independent components that can be repaired separately, similar to a car where you replace a defective part. We are a continuously tensioned, networked system. On a cellular level, this is shown very concretely via three interconnected structural levels. That is, the membrane matrix, meaning the cell membrane itself, the cytoskeleton, meaning the internal supporting framework of every cell, and the extracellular matrix, meaning the connective tissue and fascia structures between the cells. These three levels are continuously connected to each other mechanically and biochemically via small connecting structures, so-called tubules, horizontally within a tissue layer and vertically across multiple tissue layers. In very practical terms, this means a mechanical change in one place, such as a scar, an old injury, a chronic malposition in the ankle joint, propagates through this network of fascia, cytoskeleton, and connective tissue, and can manifest as a symptom in a completely different place in the body, for example, in the knee. The knee itself is completely unremarkable in the sense of being structurally intact. It only carries the tension that originated elsewhere. That is exactly why a problem in the ankle joint can end up in the knee. The body is not a sorting box of independent parts, but a tensioned, networked system in which local stimuli can have systemic effects, and vice versa. Systemic interventions can become locally effective. This image is now also well established in current specialist literature outside of microcurrent therapy. A review paper published in 2026 on fascia-directed intervention in rehabilitation explicitly describes the fascia system as a three-dimensional continuum throughout the body in which tensions can be transmitted from one region to distant areas. So a tensegrity-like biomechanical model. Published in 2026 in Frontiers, published by Bordoni and Escher. And on a cellular level, exactly this principle, as we have just described it, is confirmed in a systematic review on fascia and tensegrity. Tensegrity principles control the mechanobiological behavior of the cell there via the cytoskeleton network and enable it to react adaptively to mechanical stress. Clinically, this fascia tensegrity model also supports, among other things, the use of myofascial release therapy and targeted stretching techniques to simply restore function and integrity across the entire tension network. This is also the reason why we, at LuxAmed, consciously distinguish between system placement, regulation placement, and individually combined placements. And why this methodology, which originally comes from classic BCR therapy, we actually established this term, it comes from us, BCR, biological cell regulation therapy, is not a rigid recipe book, but a model of thinking that must be individually adapted. Once you have understood the tensegrity principle, it also becomes understandable why a purely local, symptom-oriented placement simply reaches its limits sometimes. You treat the spot where the tension becomes visible, not necessarily the spot where it originates. A small but exciting digression at the end of this topic block. Many know the rule red, so if we stay with the channels for a moment, meaning the cables where we connect the adhesive electrodes, we have anode and cathode. Red meaning the anode, always apply distally, black, the cathode, proximally. That is an idea we actually carried along for a long time, let's say until maybe 2010, so 10 years, a good 10 years. This idea goes back to a basic principle of Robert O. Becker, and his book, The Body Electric, in which the human being is described as an electrically charged system with a polarization towards the extremities. Becker was an orthopedist and researcher who investigated bioelectric phenomena in the body in the 1960s and 70s, including in connection with bone healing and regeneration. His work is part of the early scientific foundation on which classic BCR therapy actually relies. And in practice, however, it turns out, with automated systems like the Luxamed, for example, this polarity de facto no longer plays a role. If only because in our automatic mode, we don't use constant fixed polarities at all. And the device automatically determines this polarity in automatic mode via the feedback process, via the therapy algorithm. If polarity were actually crucial, yes, you have to keep that in mind, it would have to show up in practice in inconsistent results. But logically, that is not the case. The combinations of the placement, so red distal, black proximal, is therefore rather, let's say, a historically grown consistency that is no longer necessary in the actual therapeutic presentation today. And a small note on that, you always have to consider that polarity has a significant influence on whether we are in a hypo or hypermetabolic state in the tissue, so it should de facto under no circumstances be neglected. We also just spoke about the osmotic pressure ratios. It also has a very, very large influence on that. And it is not the frequencies that determine this influence, but in this case, concretely, actually the polarity. And the human being is indeed, if you will, a charged DC system. But the tissue resistance we have is a capacitive resistance and not a direct current resistance. And precisely from this electrotechnical principle, it is clearly derived that we can also, by changing the polarity here, correspondingly neglect this. Interestingly, the question of polarity is also not clearly decided in one direction in research, right? A biomechanical and histopathological study on tendon healing published in the Journal of Advanced Research specifically investigated the influence of polarity in microcurrent application and simply found different effects on the healing process depending on the chosen polarity. This shows, it was published in 2012, polarity is not fundamentally meaningless physiologically. I also explained that in connection with the capacitive resistance. But whether an automatically changing polarity in daily use absolutely requires red to be distal and black to be proximal is exactly this distinction that fundamentally simply plays no role for us. What is very clearly proven, on the other hand, especially in relation to the proven, is that the position of the electrodes itself has a measurable influence on the actual field strength in the target tissue. A veterinary study on the use of microcurrent on the superficial digital flexor tendon in horses was able to show that electrode placement significantly influences the effective field strength in the target tissue, with clear differences depending on the direction of placement, such as proximal distal versus mediolateral, is simply clearly different. In other words, and this was published in 2006 by Lind et al., in other words, where exactly the electrodes are placed and in which direction the field runs is physically relevant. Yes. A little tip on this, consider what function a horizontal tissue, a horizontal area has and what a vertical area has. So it definitely makes a difference both functionally and biomechanically or biostatically. And why it is indeed not a matter of indifference whether you apply locally or systemically. I'm not telling you this to downplay history, but because it is a beautiful example of how important it is to regularly question assumptions. We do that too. We are regularly active in research instead of simply passing things on just because it has always been done that way. So let's move on to the next part. Since we are already on the technical details, A question I am frequently asked at seminars is whether the 4 channels, we have always had a 4-channel microcurrent device. We also had a second channel, a small device. Another one will be added in a very short time. But fundamentally, we work with 4 channels, which is also important in order to be able to reach the structures well, especially systemically, which is simply not possible in that form with 2 channels. And the question is, can the channels interfere with each other? For example, if you combine several placements at the same time. For example, a local placement on the knee, and at the same time a lymph placement, yes. The answer here is quite clearly no. We have always had galvanically isolated circuits, so interference between the channels is technically simply not possible. Yes, neither constructive nor destructive interference. So you can combine several strategies at the same time without hesitation, without the channels influencing each other. If that were the case, then you'd also have to be a bit careful. Especially in the field of FSM, frequency-specific microcurrent therapy, it is of course important that the frequency on my one channel, so let's say tissue frequency, is logically not influenced by the condition frequency of another channel. So technically speaking, this is very, very important. A second practical point concerns the light channels. That is an important aspect. The light channels are assigned in our system. So we have 2 light channels, 4 microcurrent channels, so we have a fixed assignment here. Light channel 1 is assigned to our A channel, and light channel 2 is assigned to the C channel. That means the color in which a light head, so to speak, shines also indirectly gives you information about how the polarity of the channel is currently assigned, which in practice can of course be a useful and small feedback signal when you are working in the automatic range and need a quick visual reference point without having to look at the display specifically. And while we are on the subject of pinpoint application, an older but still relevant paper from the Cranio Journal deals specifically with the identification and treatment of trigger points using microcurrent. It's by Dupont et al. 1999. The core idea there, before you even decide on a placement, it is worth actively palpating for trigger points, meaning for the small hyper-irritable nodules in the muscle tissue that typically radiate to other regions when pressure is applied. This is basically a very practical bridge between our block on myofascial chains and the concrete question of where you should actually place the electrodes. Not blindly according to a scheme, but where palpation actually shows a reaction time. And of course, in the radiation area. There, of course, you can also bring in the dermatomes. You can use any areas. If you, as a non-medical practitioner, work more in the field of TCM, you can, of course, also take these aspects. You can bring in organ areas if you come from the osteopathic corner, visceral osteopathic corner, and so on. So to conclude this practical block, a note on an alternative in electrode placement in practice that is often overlooked. There are also conductive gloves and socks. Instead of the classic adhesive electrodes, you can also simply use conductive textiles for certain applications, for example, on the hands or feet, yes, which are woven with a fine metal thread. The advantage is that you can put them on and take them off quickly, especially when patients are supposed to sit quietly and be treated over a longer period of time. It is important to know if you as a practitioner are involved in the circuit with bare hands, so if you use it as a practitioner. Of course, because you are holding an electrode in your hand while working manually. Therapeutically, of course, that is harmless, but you are, after all, included in the circuit. You can, of course, solve that simply with classic disposable latex or, gloves. From a hygienic point of view, however, it should be borne in mind here that such textile electrodes, unlike the adhesive electrodes, fundamentally must be cleaned before they are used on the next patient. That should, of course, be taken into account. What do you practically take away from this episode now? I have written down 4 concrete points for you here. First, with every placement, ask yourself the 3 basic questions that we also ask again and again in our seminars. What is the idea of the local application in this case? What does a local application do? Does it make sense at all? And what should I keep in mind? In particular, have I really already ruled out the actual cause, or am I only treating the place where the symptom shows up? These three questions might cost a minute of reflection before the treatment, but they can make the difference between a therapy that has a lasting effect and a therapy that perhaps simply brings a short-term effect for the patient, but simply ends up wasting time. Second, actively ask questions instead of just looking at the symptom mentioned to you by the patient. Patients don't automatically report everything. An old scar, I've experienced this, an old appendix scar from over 25 years ago. Appendix out, of course, almost forgotten, actually had an influence, a previous trauma. So the classic example, of course, cervical whiplash trauma from a rear-end collision, car accident, or other accidents. A fall years ago that was never really treated. Appendix out, of course, almost forgotten, actually had an influence, a previous trauma. So the classic example, of course, cervical whiplash trauma from a rear-end collision, car accident, or other accidents. A fall years ago that was never really treated. Especially non-medical practitioners who work with the concept of interference fields know how relevant such overlooked factors can simply be. A scar, depending on its location and history, can form a local interference field that affects a completely different region of the body without the patient coming up with the idea of mentioning it on their own. They don't suspect that the anamnesis before commit to a placement, so to speak.
Third, if Ryan says now to change the strategy that is for personas, right? If the first one doesn't work, but if you don't see a reaction, and then then let's talk.
One, or let's say maybe two, to see an adequate response. That is simply my experience model of the last, well over 25 years. And that is no reason to just keep going as before, but you can, of course, get a very clear signal to question the placement. Maybe switch from local to systemic, combine both, or vice versa. And thanks to the 4 galvanically isolated channels, that is technically not a problem at all, without the placements influencing each other, being influenced. And fourth, use your own individually adapted placements instead of adopting every template unchanged. The system gives you the option to save your own electrode placements. You can record them. That is exactly what this function is intended for. And at the end of the day, I always say, the answer to the correct electrode placement is given to you by the patient. And the pathology, the function behind the problem itself, if you, of course, test and ask specifically here. Yes, that is basically the professional answer to the question of copy and paste. So not blind copying of someone else's template, but the conscious building of one's own and justified repertoire, which I think we have discussed in detail here in this episode. So an electrode placement is thus not a template that you simply transfer. It is an idea, a starting point that you have to adapt to the situation, the anamnesis, and the findings of your respective patient. Local if the cause is local, global if it is simply not. Sometimes both at the same time, precisely thanks to the possibility you naturally have here, thanks to the technical possibility you naturally have all the prerequisites here. And also always think of the combination with light therapy. That is a very, very important aspect. I hope this somewhat more detailed episode gives you a bit more confidence in not just adopting placements, but really understanding whether you lean more towards the symptom-oriented Davos logic or the systemic view with the regulation concept, or what happens most frequently in practice anyway, a completely unique one, because that's where the whole system comes from. It has developed through our advanced training, through our seminars, through the exchange with the many, many hundreds of doctors, therapists, not only in Germany, we are also very active abroad. I spent a lot of time in Italy for many years, met many great therapists and doctors there, especially in the field of osteopathy. In my perception, it is also different in Italy. There it is all more university-based, and there were very, very great points of discussion and also good approaches and good combination ideas, and that's how the whole thing came about in the end. In that sense, I say thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being there. Be sure to check out social media, see what's always new there from us, and look forward to the next podcast episode. And don't forget, please subscribe to our podcast and feel free to recommend it to others. Yes, in that sense, thank you very much and see you next time.